He was born in a Bedouin tent, came to power in a coup, and for more than 40 years, Muammar Gaddafi has stood as one of the most bizarre characters on the world stage. But while his team of virgin female bodyguards and shifting political allegiances gave an eccentric mystique, Gaddafi ruled Libya like any other tyrant.
Muammar Gaddafi, once Libya's powerful leader.
No one against us. Against me for what? Because I am not president.
But then
they love me, all my people with me. They love me all.
But if they do love you,
they will die to protect me, my people.
Terrified Western countries and their military groups like the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. He dreamed of uniting Africa with a new currency, the Gold Dinar, which could reduce Western influence. His daring speeches, especially his critical words at the United Nations,
وهذا الكتاب الأبيض هذا الكتاب الأبيض فيه الحل صراطي بعدين يا علي بشر
led to his elimination in a North Atlantic Treaty Organization-backed rebellion.
Some nations may be able to turn a blind eye to atrocities in other countries. The United States of America is different. And as president, I refuse to wait for the images of slaughter and mass graves before taking action.
What if the speech that sealed his fate still holds dangerous secrets? Let's explore the dark secrets that brought down a leader. Number 1. How Gaddafi's plans shook the West. During his speech, Gaddafi took his time to expose the dishonesty at the heart of global politics. He criticized the fact that, although leaders from 192 countries come to the United Nations to give speeches full of promises, these promises are rarely kept. He accused the Western powers of manipulating these global meetings to get what they want, pretending that the whole world agreed with them. This speech didn't just ruffle feathers, it caused outright panic among those who wanted to maintain the status quo. Let's delve into the specifics of that speech and explore why his straightforward, uncompromising words were considered so dangerous. We'll see how speaking truth to power in an arena that prefers shadows and secrecy could be enough to seal his fate. Muammar Gaddafi was not one to keep his thoughts to himself, especially when criticizing big international organizations like the United Nations. He boldly called out the United Nations, claiming it was essentially a tool used by Western countries to push their own agendas. Gaddafi questioned the very foundations of the United Nations, asking people to consider the conditions under which it was established. He pointed out that the Security Council, which wields significant power within the United Nations, was set up by the countries that came together to defeat Germany in World War II.
The death of another loathed Middle Eastern tyrant, a man who was also for decades a sponsor of international terror, Muammar Gaddafi.
This council included permanent members who could veto any decision, a power that wasn't given to many other countries that joined the United Nations later. According to Gaddafi, this setup was a clear sign of how the United Nations was skewed to favor the powerful allies from the war. Gaddafi went further to explain that during the introduction of the United Nations, authorities talks about high ideals like equality among all nations. The actual operation of the United Nations tells a different story. He highlighted that the preamble of the authorities promotes fairness and equality. But the reality is that the permanent members of the Security Council can basically control decisions with their veto power. Gaddafi openly rejected the legitimacy of this veto power. He believed that such power contradicts the principle of equality that the United Nations claims to uphold. According to him, it makes a mockery of the idea that all nations have an equal say in matters of international importance. Moreover, Gaddafi stressed that the authorities' preamble states that armed force should only be used for the common good of all nations, a commitment all member countries agreed to upon joining the UN. However, since the creation of the United Nations, he pointed out that 65 wars have occurred, causing more death and destruction than even World War II. Gaddafi argued that these wars were not fought for the common good, but were maneuvers to serve the interests of a few powerful countries. This, he claimed, was a blatant betrayal of the principles laid out in the United Nations authorities. Gaddafi's insistence on adhering to the preamble's principles and challenging the UN's current structure was a call for major reform. He made it clear that the existence of veto powers and permanent seats for select countries does not align with the supposed values of equality and fairness the United Nations preaches. This, in his view, is a significant hypocrisy within the organization, undermining its credibility and moral authority. Gaddafi's critique was not just a passing comment, it was a deep and scathing analysis of how the United Nations functions. He saw the organization as flawed, serving the interests of the powerful rather than truly fostering global cooperation and peace. As Gaddafi spoke up more, the West wanted even more to stop him. What did he say that made him such a big threat? Number 2. Gaddafi calls out United Nations hypocrisy. According to the rules written by the United Nations authorities, using military force should only be done through an agreement by all member countries and led by a UN-controlled force. However, the reality is often far from this ideal. We frequently see a small group of powerful nations acting on their own, launching military interventions without waiting for approval from the wider United Nations community. This behavior starkly undermines the supposed authority and effectiveness of the United Nations, exposing a glaring disconnect between what the United Nations preaches and what it practices. Gaddafi was quick to call out this hypocrisy, especially highlighting how the Western nations manipulated their supposed commitment to the United Nations principles to suit their own ends. One of the United Nations authorities' core principles is the non-interference in states' internal affairs. It's a simple yet profound rule. No country should interfere in the politics of another country, regardless of what kind of government that country has, whether it's a democracy, a dictatorship, or any other form. Gaddafi argued that every society has the right to sort out its own problems without outsiders stepping in and meddling. Yet, this principle is frequently ignored by the more powerful nations, who often interfere in other countries under various pretexts, disregarding the sovereignty and independence of those nations. Delving deeper into his critique, Gaddafi addressed the undemocratic nature of the United Nations Security Council's structure. He pointed out that the Security Council, which has the most power within the United Nations, is dominated by a few countries with permanent seats and veto powers. According to Gaddafi, this setup is a clear violation of the democratic ideals and equality the United Nations claims to uphold. All United Nations members did not democratically assign permanent membership and the power to veto, but rather claimed by a select few powerful countries after World War II. This privilege allows them to block any decision, no matter how many other countries agree on it. Such an arrangement directly contradicts the principles of equality and fairness, effectively giving disproportionate power to a small group while sidelining the majority. Gaddafi highlighted the absurdity and unfairness of this system by comparing it to historical events. He referred to ancient Rome, where the North Atlantic Treaty Organizations appointed Julius Caesar as a dictator because they thought it would benefit the city-state. He emphasized that even in ancient Rome, there was no concept similar to the veto power wielded by modern-day permanent members of the Security Council, a power that isn't even mentioned in the United Nations authorities. Gaddafi expressed the frustration felt by African nations which joined the United Nations, believing they were entering a forum of equals. Instead, they discovered they were part of an organization where their voices could be easily silenced by any single veto from one of the privileged countries. In the intricate web of the United Nations, there stands a curious anomaly. Only China managed to secure its spot on the Security Council through what could pass as a democratic process. The rest, their seats were handed to them in a manner resembling more of a top-down directive than any kind of democratic choice. This was not a decision embraced by the global community, but rather imposed by those who already wielded power, much to the frustration of everyone else. Gaddafi, ever the outspoken critic, didn't hesitate to highlight this hypocrisy. He argued that simply adding more members to the already flawed Security Council wouldn't solve the underlying issues. If anything, it would worsen them by further entrenching the power of the world's superpowers while continuing to marginalize smaller and developing nations who already find themselves overshadowed and underrepresented. Firm in his conviction, Gaddafi opposed the notion of introducing any additional permanent seats to the Security Council. He believed that the real change needed to come from a radical restructuring of the United Nations itself. His proposal? Empower the General Assembly, where all 192 member countries are represented, to have the final say on international matters. In Gaddafi's vision, the General Assembly wouldn't just be a platform for discussion, but a powerful body whose decisions are binding, even for those countries that hold veto power in the Security Council. Gaddafi was critical of the West's double standards. On the global stage, Western nations often use the banner of democracy to legitimize their actions and interventions in other countries. Yet, within the confines of the United Nations, they conveniently ignore these democratic ideals, particularly regarding the Security Council's structure. Gaddafi saw an urgent need to enforce equality among all member states, advocating for a significant shift of powers from the Security Council to the General Assembly. According to Gaddafi, the General Assembly should assume the legislative authority, making laws and decisions that bind all members, including the elite few who currently dominate the Security Council. This would turn the tables on the current dynamics, where the Security Council has disproportionate control over the General Assembly. Instead, he proposed that the Security Council should serve as a representative body that mirrors the true diversity of the world, including giving permanent seats to unions and regional groups. Gaddafi's plan didn't just stop at restructuring. It included specific suggestions to ensure more equitable representation. For example, he proposed that Africa, often sidelined in global decisions, should be guaranteed a permanent seat at the table. This would not only allow African nations to discuss and influence their own regional issues, but also play a more active role in shaping global policies. This approach, he argued, would foster a more inclusive and fair international environment, promoting global peace and security from a more balanced perspective. His critique and proposals aimed to dismantle the existing power hierarchies within the United Nations and establish a more democratic global governance structure. This shift, he hoped, would correct the imbalances and injustices of the current system, creating a United Nations that truly lives up to its name and foundational principles. By advocating for these changes, Gaddafi was not just challenging the status quo, but inviting nations worldwide to rethink how global governance could and should function, emphasizing fairness, equality, and true democratic representation. Diving into Gaddafi's bold words at the United Nations, let's see how his speeches shook the world's power balance. Number 3. Gaddafi's vision for democratic global governance. What did Gaddafi really think about changes to the United Nations that could diminish Western dominance? He openly criticized the current setup, suggesting a dramatic overhaul that would strip the Security Council of its autonomous powers and place it firmly under the control of the General Assembly. His vision was to democratize the United Nations, making the General Assembly the primary authority, which would then dictate the actions of the Security Council. This idea wasn't just about shuffling positions, it was about redefining who holds the power at the United Nations, ensuring that it is evenly distributed among all member nations rather than concentrated in the hands of a few. Gaddafi was very vocal about the inherent inequality within the Security Council. The existence of permanent seats and veto powers creates a tiered system where some countries wield disproportionate influence over global decisions. This setup, he argued, breeds injustice and should be dismantled. According to him, any resolutions passed by the Security Council in its current form are invalid because they reflect the interests of a powerful few rather than the collective will. He saw the Security Council as a body that had long deviated from its original purpose of maintaining global peace and security. instead becoming a vehicle for the superpowers to propagate their interests, spread fear, impose sanctions, and initiate conflicts. Moreover, Gaddafi highlighted how this skewed structure allowed superpowers to manipulate the United Nations to enforce their will, often at the expense of smaller or developing nations. Since its inception in 1945, instead of fostering peace, the Security Council had often fueled hostilities and been complicit in acts that go against the very essence of the United Nations authorities.
Since its founding in 1945, the United Nations has always been center stage for global grandstanding. Who could forget former Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi's 2009 appearance?
Gaddafi argued that such a blatant misuse of power and trust was unacceptable and called for an urgent reevaluation and restructuring of how authority is exercised within the UN. On the topic of United Nations resolutions aligning with Western interests, Gaddafi strongly refused to comply. He dismissed Security Council resolutions that perpetuate conflicts and oppression.
It should not be called the Security Council, it should be called the Terror Council.
As tools powerful nations use to maintain their grip on less powerful ones. He rejected the notion of accepting authority from a council that operates with such apparent bias, especially criticizing the veto power held by the permanent members. This veto power, he argued, was used not only to block actions that might disadvantage the superpowers, but also to sideline and diminish the voices of smaller nations, treating them as inferior or irrelevant. Gaddafi contended that the superpowers were never legitimately appointed to represent the interests of the 192 countries in the United Nations. This self-appointment undermines the democratic principles the United Nations is supposed to uphold and fosters resentment and division among member states. The selective application of Security Council resolutions, which are enforced against weaker nations while ignoring transgressions by the powerful, only exacerbates global inequalities and leads to international strife, sovereignty violations, war crimes, and genocides. Gaddafi sharply criticized a significant shift that was happening globally. Countries were losing faith in the United Nations Security Council's ability to ensure peace and security genuinely. Because of this, regions worldwide have created their own safety nets. The African and European Union and various Asian nations have each established their own regional security councils. Latin America and a large group of 120 non-aligned nations are on the brink of doing the same. This trend clearly indicates the dwindling confidence in the Security Council, seen by many as an ineffective, undemocratic, and unfair institution that has repeatedly failed to live up to its promises. Digging deeper into international governance, Gaddafi shed light on another troubling issue: the international courts, which he believed were finally proving his earlier criticisms to be correct. He observed a blatant lack of respect for the United Nations General Assembly, which holds little to no authority over binding resolutions, despite being the true representative body of the world. He noted that the International Court of Justice's decisions reflect a deep-seated bias that targets smaller and third-world countries while allowing the more powerful nations to escape scrutiny and accountability. Similarly, the International Atomic Energy Agency focuses its efforts predominantly on monitoring smaller countries, rarely applying the same level of scrutiny to the major powers. Gaddafi also voiced a demand that particularly alarmed Western powers. He insisted on the necessity of granting Africa a permanent seat on the Security Council. Given Africa's painful history of colonization, isolation, persecution, and exploitation, he argued that it was not just beneficial, but a matter of justice and redress for historical grievances that African countries receive proper representation. This stance was not merely a request, but a pressing demand, reflecting a deeper recognition of the imbalances and injustices that the current global system has long perpetuated. Moreover, Gaddafi emphasized that irrespective of broader United Nations reforms, the representation of Africa on the Security Council was a critical and non-negotiable issue. He pointed out that the historical debt owed to African nations made their inclusion essential for a fair and just international governance structure. By championing this cause, Gaddafi was not just highlighting an oversight, he was challenging the very foundations of international political power, calling for a re-evaluation of who gets to make decisions on the global stage. He argued that without addressing these fundamental disparities, the Security Council would continue to lack legitimacy and moral authority, ultimately undermining the United Nations' mission to foster global peace and security. With the world's attention, Gaddafi didn't just talk, he demanded big changes. How did his calls for rights in Africa create worldwide tension? Number 4. The African Union's right to a seat. Gaddafi was straightforward and forceful in his words. He did not mince them. He openly refused to bow or offer praises to the powerful nations that proudly wear their veto powers like medals of honor in a club where only a few truly hold sway. He firmly rejected the idea of letting these so-called superpowers dictate terms to smaller nations, treating them as if they were lesser, almost like uninvited guests to their own party. He challenged the very legitimacy of their authority, pointing out that there was never a global vote that appointed these nations as the leaders of all 192 countries. So why, Gaddafi provocatively asked, shouldn't the African Union also hold a permanent seat at the table where critical global decisions are made? His challenge wasn't just a simple question. It was a powerful call to rethink who gets to have a say in world affairs. How, he argued, could anyone who genuinely values fairness and equality deny such a request? But Gaddafi didn't just stop at questioning the existing power dynamics. He dug deeper, hitting a very sore spot when he demanded reparations from the countries that had once colonized and exploited Africa, Asia, and Latin America. He wasn't trying to stir up trouble for the sake of it, he was aiming for justice. He viewed reparations as essential, not just as a way to make amends for past atrocities, but as a means to ensure that the dark history of colonization doesn't repeat itself. These reparations were also about protecting his continent's rights and stopping the continued siphoning of its wealth. Why, Gaddafi pointedly asked, are so many individuals from these historically plundered regions flocking to Europe? His answer was laden with harsh reality. They are escaping the devastation of their homelands, still suffering from the long-term effects of being raided and stripped bare. They are in pursuit of the prosperity that was stolen from them, now fueling the economies of Europe. The new generations of these continents aren't migrating for minor reasons. They're on a quest to take back what was wrongfully taken from their ancestors. Gaddafi recounted meeting 1,000 African migrants on their way to Europe. When he asked them about their journey's purpose, their answer was not just moving. They were going to reclaim their stolen wealth. He argued that if this wealth was returned, fewer people would need to leave places like the Philippines, Latin America, and India in search of a better life. Gaddafi claimed that Africa is owed a jaw-dropping $777 trillion by the countries that colonized it. This wasn't just a figure pulled from thin air, it was calculated based on the immense value of what was taken. He made it clear, Africans wouldn't just request this amount politely. They would demand it, pursue it with all their might, and not rest until every bit of what was unjustly taken from them was returned. According to Gaddafi, it was their absolute right to demand back everything stolen from them. So what was Gaddafi's view on Obama, who was the US president at that time? You need to understand that Gaddafi considered himself pretty smart, capable of handling even the most powerful person in the world. He commented on the significant moment it was for Africa to see one of their own as the President of the United States, describing it as a big step forward. Yet, he couldn't help but express some doubts, pointing out that Obama's time as president would be short. He pondered over what might happen to America's leadership after Obama, and half-jokingly wished Obama could stay president forever. While he praised Obama for advocating nuclear disarmament and calling for countries to work together, he was quick to demand that these shouldn't just be empty promises. There needed to be real, solid action. But wrapped in this was a deeper irony, perhaps unknown or overlooked by Gaddafi at the time. It would be during Obama's leadership that Gaddafi himself would be overthrown and killed. Maybe Gaddafi's comments were tinged with an unknowing warning, or maybe he simply never anticipated such an outcome. Then, Gaddafi made a bold proposal to move the United Nations headquarters. During one of his speeches at the United Nations, he criticized the inconvenience of having such an important global institution in New York. He pointed out how ridiculous it was for leaders from around the world to travel thousands of miles, crossing seas and continents just to meet. He compared New York with sacred places like Jerusalem, the Vatican, or Mecca, questioning whether New York held the same kind of spiritual significance that justified such difficult journeys. Gaddafi gave a vivid picture of the world's leaders, exhausted from long flights, suffering from jet lag, and struggling to stay awake during meetings. Some had just endured grueling 20-hour flights and were expected to deliver speeches and make decisions. The room, he suggested, was filled with leaders barely able to keep their eyes open, nodding off in the middle of sessions. Gaddafi's point was clear. The hassle of travel, the sleep-deprived diplomats, it was all a circus, perhaps unnecessary and certainly outdated. Was all this really needed for international diplomacy, or was it just an old tradition that made no sense in today's world? Gaddafi was suggesting that perhaps there was a better, more logical place for these vital gatherings, a place that wouldn't demand such arduous travel and could host meaningful discussions without the added burden of extreme fatigue. As Gaddafi's ideas kept spreading, let's look at how his suggestion to move the United Nations headquarters challenged and embarrassed the powerful. Number 5. Gaddafi's major challenge to international law. Why do we have to keep dealing with such annoyances? Isn't it high time we questioned our adherence to a decision made way back in 1945? Can't we pick a spot that's more in the middle and easier for everyone to get to? Gaddafi didn't just throw this idea out casually. He seriously proposed that the General Assembly should take a vote on moving the United Nations headquarters. He argued that if just over half the members, 51%, agree, then they should vote again to decide on a new, more central location, perhaps in the heart of the globe or somewhere in the Eastern Hemisphere. Why not think about cities like Geneva or Vienna, which are known for their neutrality and accessibility? His proposal cleverly pointed out a major issue. The significant decisions that affect the whole world shouldn't just be made from the comfort of an office in the United States. Instead, he suggested a more democratic approach, where every country could have a say through voting, truly reflecting a global perspective. But how did Gaddafi manage to make the United Nations and its major powers feel both embarrassed and uneasy? He didn't hold back in his critique, listing various conflicts where the United Nations just watched as the West manipulated it to their advantage. For example, he brought up the Korean War, which resulted in millions of deaths and teetered on the brink of nuclear disaster. He argued that those responsible for such reckless decisions should be put on trial for the damage they caused. Then there was the Suez Canal crisis in 1956, where three powerful nations, all members of the Security Council with veto power, attacked Egypt, causing widespread destruction. Gaddafi pointedly questioned how such a fiasco could occur under the supposed supervision of the UN. He also highlighted the Vietnam War, where the casualty numbers climbed to 3 million, with bombing runs that in just 12 days surpassed the intensity of the aerial bombardments during the entirety of World War II. He pressed the question, how can we stand by and allow history to just repeat itself like this? And how did Gaddafi plant doubts about the United Nations across the world? He posed a straightforward yet sharp question. Can the world really place its trust in the Security Council and the United Nations as a whole? He used the war in Iraq as a prime example of the dark sides of conflict. Gaddafi insisted that the United Nations must initiate an investigation into this matter immediately. This invasion, spearheaded by superpowers that hold permanent seats on the Security Council, starkly violated the United Nations authorities. Iraq, a sovereign nation and a member of the United Nations, was attacked in clear defiance of international law. By raising these points, Gaddafi wasn't merely throwing around accusations. He was strategically highlighting a pattern of inconsistency and failure at the highest levels of global governance. His criticisms were meant to do more than just provoke thought. They aimed to expose the hypocrisy and ineffectiveness of the United Nations, urging people everywhere to reconsider this global body's real role and effectiveness. Through these actions, Gaddafi wasn't just stirring up debate, he was calling for a fundamental reevaluation of how global decisions are made and questioning whether the institutions in place truly serve the worldwide community or just the interests of a few powerful countries. The United Nations sat back and did nothing, even though there were loud calls from within the General Assembly for it to take action. Libya was caught in a terrible war and tried to use the United Nations authorities to stop the fighting. But nobody listened to their calls for help. The real reasons behind the invasion remain hidden under a veil of secrecy, leaving other countries worried that they might be the next targets. The invasion itself blatantly ignored the principles laid out by the United Nations authorities. What followed was a massacre with more than 1.5 million Iraqis losing their lives, a horrific loss that demands justice. Gaddafi was insistent that the International Criminal Court should examine the horrors faced by Iraq. He wanted the people responsible for the atrocities committed against Iraqi civilians to be put on trial. This idea made Western leaders nervous. They were haunted by the thought that if Gaddafi continued to be a voice of authority, he would relentlessly push for accountability, making them explain and justify every action they had taken. Gaddafi then raised a disturbing point. How was it possible that the president of a United Nations member state was sentenced to death and executed, yet the identities of those who carried out the execution remain unknown? He argued that the United Nations must tackle these serious issues. Those who carried out the execution should be officially recognized and their roles clarified. Gaddafi called for transparency, asserting that the global community deserves to know who these individuals are and understand the legal processes that allowed such actions. He emphasized that this need for clarity and accountability isn't just for the leaders of United Nations member states, but applies to any person who faces similar situations. But how did Gaddafi embarrass the United States specifically? He brought up the tragic assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., a highly respected advocate for the civil rights of Black Americans. Gaddafi suggested that King's murder was not just a random act, but part of a deeper, more sinister scheme. He stressed the importance of investigating further to uncover the true reasons behind King's assassination and identify those responsible. By bringing this up, Gaddafi not only highlighted a grave and painful event in American history, but also pointed to a pattern of unresolved and serious issues within the United States. This move challenged the country's moral standing on the world stage, suggesting that America had its own dark secrets and unresolved issues. Gaddafi's comments were not just criticisms. They were a call to action, urging a closer look at international and internal injustices that had been overlooked or covered up. His challenge was clear. If the United States wants to lead on the global stage, it must first address and resolve the injustices within its own borders, ensuring transparency and accountability at all levels. This call for introspection and accountability was designed to make everyone rethink their own positions and the broader implications of justice on a global scale. Was Gaddafi's death merely a power play, or are there deeper secrets still hidden? What do you think? Don't forget to like and subscribe for more thought-provoking content.